Thanks very much for those words, Pete. It just gives a bit of background to where I've been. I probably know where I'm heading as well, but at this stage I'll get as much off my chest that might be of interest to others. My involvement with the film industry and PNG, there was a bit of a blending there of respect for a cameraman. He was a legendary wartime news cameraman. You might have heard of Damien Parra. Damien would appear in the book in a few instances, and he also came up against MacArthur's problems. You wonder that little thing on the bottom, deconstructing decades of divisive deception. That's roughly translated as cutting through the bullshit, which I have tried to do. I don't want to be perceived as any sort of military historian. I'm just an inquisitive, used to be a newsreel and TV cameraman, just trying to dig behind what's going on, and that was my interest. As a young guy living in Bicton, I was born just a couple of days after the Big War started, and I was going to primary school, started primary school at Richmond there, while the war was just petering out. I didn't have much recollection of the war, except that I knew at the time that the Kokoda Trail that was somewhere up in New Guinea. And the only time you really heard anything about what was going on, if you went to the local picture show and they'd put on a newsreel before the show. I can't remember my mum and dad subscribing to newspapers, but I believe it was in newspapers, Kokoda Trail. And on the wireless, you heard stories about what was happening up in New Guinea. I saw no reason to take much notice at the time. It was only when, in '62, I went up, or I joined the Cinematographer Society prior to that, and the legends of the film industry were sort of bandied around. I'd heard about this guy, Damien Parra, he was up in New Guinea, and his exploits in the Middle East and up in the Pacific. So I was a bit curious. So when I went up there, initially to start the government unit, I was intrigued about this is where I knew he was shooting and all that sort of stuff. I had a great admiration for the guy, but hadn't got any, never met him. Yeah, he was famous for shooting the first film that won an Oscar. It was Kokoda Frontline. He personally narrated the film, basically explaining to apathetic Australians the danger they faced. Everybody was very complacent about the Japanese coming over the Owen Stanleys. And he went up and shot some great footage. He also did Men of Timor, but that one was the first Oscar Australia ever won for a film. So just a little bit of trivia for the next quiz night. And first, when I went up there, I then joined the Aero Club of Papua to continue my flying. It was the only aero club up there in PNG at the time. I think the fleet was a Tiger Moth and a Cessna 170, little old tail dragger, pretty basic. But the president of the club was Vince Sanders. In fact, he probably owned the Tiger. And he had an interesting career. He'd been up there pre-war and through the war and that. He was a pretty rich guy. Well, owning an aircraft, I suppose you have to have a quid. And he made nearly all his money by cleaning up after the war, down the track, anywhere down the coast there of Papua. And I was involved in going out at some of those wrecks and retrieving aircraft. I was shooting stories for Movie Tone at the time and pulling these almost pristine aircraft that had crash landed in some of I think it was about 13 strips or something within 30 miles of Port Moresby. They were cut into kunai on the beaches way out in Jogo Island, just out from Port Moresby. There's airstrips everywhere. I cover a bit about that in my little book. So he made all this money by selling these beautiful, pristine aircraft. You'd pay a king's ransom for one of them these days, probably because they barely landed and the kunai didn't get much damage, but they're still armed with their cannon and all that sort of stuff, their ammunition. It's quite an interesting situation. So I was involved, I get the feeling for the warfare that took place by visiting some of these places. As Pete said, I was up there with the government, then I had a stoush with Sir Donald Cleland, who was the administrator, who had a difference of opinion over bureaucracy. So I got offered a job down there. Well, I'd sort of resigned, and I got my first ulcer working for the government, by the way. I pulled the pin, went down, and by then I was sending, I was the only guy up in PNG from there through to about 67. There was nobody else up there regularly shooting news film. Even though it was coming up to independence, even the department I was working for only was allowed to shoot film for other departments on how to grow coffee or how to, all that sort of internal training films. They weren't allowed. I purchased a 16mm camera up there and at the weekends and bought some film stock, and I was going out weekends shooting news stories. I think the first news story I shot, I sent back to, it was SAS from Swanbourne. I knew a couple of guys in the SAS. They were on doing their exercises or whatever up there. And so I'd make another good story for Perth. So I shot it off and sent it back to Darcy, and he ran it. Well, that was quite a good little work too, because my fiancée at the time was back here, I was up there. And I thought it was probably so easier to shoot a bit of newsreel of what's going on and send it back to the news. I don't have to bother writing letters. And it got me off the hook there quite well. But that was, that got me started. I was then syndicated around Australia, and all the other stations were getting it. And when I got told by the administrator, you either shape up or ship out, I decided to go overseas again, back to Sydney. I was fortunate when I joined the department there, I met I'd say a crusty old bird she was. She's great, Kate Vellicott-Jones. She was an ABC journalist, British-Canadian. She was in the Moresby before the war. She was on MacArthur's war correspondence, press corps, whatever you like. In fact, she was the one that gave me a bit of a heads up and confirming, because while I was at the Aero Club, I was hearing all these talk about the track. I was, what's the trail, isn't it? No, everybody's talking about the track. And that started to get me quite sort of interested, what's going on? So then, having working with Kate for a while, I questioned it. She said MacArthur got rid of correspondence, de-enfranchised them off if they dared call it a track. It's got to be called a trail. As MacArthur and his team, whether it's cartographers or any the intelligence, there is the argument, and valid argument, that there was multiple parallel tracks going over between the villages, over the Owen Stanleys. But I think it's for the intelligence people, they called it collectively the trail. But everywhere you find, if you dig back into the now available diaries of the diggers, they're all referring to the track. In fact, early in my starting of this book, and look, I think it's being pretentious to call it, but I call it a short essay on steroids. It's, it started off as just an article for a newspaper, and it sort of grew and grew. So it sort of evolved. It evolved as I found more information that I thought was credible. Some of it I was going on proved to be not credible, which I'll tell you about later. I was convinced then, hearing a first-hand account of someone that's at these conferences, that I'm on the right track. So on that basis, I sort of, I left briefly for working in Sydney. I was sent back more often to pull up in Guinea than I was in Sydney, because there was so much happening up there and nobody else was covering it. I was on contract there for 18 months, about 15 months. It hit the fan, so I rang up my fiancée, can you organise a wedding for next 2 weeks' time? I'm glad I wasn't home when that hit the fan, but anyhow, she did it. And we went straight back up to New Guinea and started our own business. So I was a freelancer, not then encumbered by bureaucracy and inefficiencies. So that was good for me, and sending the stuff out. Now, I mentioned recently, like, the track is definitely what the diggers all called it. And it's only just, last week or the week before, I went and met up with Bill Graydon, who's 104. I'd contacted Bill probably about 8 years ago, because this project of mine's been in the gestation there for nearly 10 years. There was no great rush to finish it, but I was just adding bits as I was flying it up. That, initially when I contacted Bill relating to the same subject, he was quite coherent, but it's his sons that did most of the chatting last week. He gave me a copy of his book, because I went over there to give him a copy of mine, because he'd given us some original information. And he gave me a copy of his, Kokoda Lieutenant, and it's surprising that I haven't come across that book before, because there it was, first-hand information of the whole campaign from a credible person who was there. He didn't write it to sell books or anything like that. It's purely his account. And if I'd only seen this book a year or two ago, my little effort might have had a bit more strength. Anyhow, that's digressing. But what prompted me to just the recent call, some of you may have seen on in the West, that Malcolm Queckett, who does a lot of interesting stuff, historical, did something on Kokoda, and it was about Bill Graydon. Over the years, I've been seeing stuff in the West there, and about the Kokoda Trail, and I ring up the journalist and say, hey, look, are you sure oh, look, we know it's the track, but it's the paper's policy to follow the War Memorial's example. I know it is, because Stokesy was the chairman of the War Memorial about 8 or 9 years ago when I first tackled them about what they were doing. So he has a vested interest to keep trail in the West. And I just mentioned to Malcolm about that, and it was big headlines. The whole thing was made to be trail, and Bill, but not once in Bill's book he ever mentions trail. Little things like that start to give you the idea you could be on the right track, track, not trail. So that's a bit of background how all this came together. I've had this good relationship with the memorial all this time, and even like just before Easter last year, I had a good meeting over there with Matt Anderson, the director, and Carl James, who's the history collection manager, and he's written a couple of good books on it, and they respect what I'm writing. In fact, when I went to see Matt Anderson there, we just got talking, and it seems that we're both in signals, and we got chatting more about the Nashos and things like that, so I have a good relationship with them. But also, as I found more about why they're persevering, I've realised they are locked in to a bureaucratic culture of not ever discrediting your predecessors. So because it was deemed to be the official name was the Kokoda Trail, so they're obliged to go with it. Same, I've been in touch and working with the Australian Army History Unit, again, feeding them copies of what I'm doing and just let them know I'm not going behind the back, giving them a hard time. I'm sort of laying it as I'm seeing it and giving them every opportunity to change. So we just pushed forward on that basis. Now, MacArthur's military history. Digging back into MacArthur, the more you dig, the more disgusted you get with the guy. Him and his lapdog Blamey did so much damage to highly experienced officers, Australian officers, in their careers, just destroyed them by all the undermining and all that's going on. And I've covered quite a few instances in the book. And then being sent up to help defend the Philippines, and he was such I don't know, hardly a commander you would admire, the troops up in the Philippines, when they were trying to hold the Japanese back, they never saw him. He was down in the bunker. So he had got the nickname Dugout Doug from all the troops. He was not respected at all. And then when they were approaching, he disappeared with his Bataan was the name of the place. So this group of his favourite clique of officers, they called the Bataan Gang. In the middle of the night they took off and headed down to Australia, where he was appointed Supreme Commander. First of all, living in absolute luxury in Melbourne, while the rest of Australia was suffering wartime hardship. So it was not exactly... But he wasn't terribly impressed, but he did impress the politicians. He was a saviour who was going to come to protect Australia, and they suddenly woke up, hey, they got a problem, all these guys coming over hills. So he was lauded and, but he was told by the military heavyweights in Washington, get Australian specialists, officers around you. They're experienced in jungle fighting, all that sort of stuff. He ignored the whole lot of them and still had his clique defeated from the Philippines. Digging back into the history, okay, what was going on around that time? And it seemed all our troops had been singing Churchill's tune and wedded to the Middle East there and all the rest of it. It had to be brought back, and that's when I was starting to get myself into trouble by recording stuff that I'd written or that I'd seen written in other publications, because I'd studied stuff that's been done officially by popular journalists, by universities of Wollongong and all that, about the various people, and just trying to cross-reference, because the expertise I really needed was in Mount Pleasant and Graham Mackenzie Smith. Just purely during the publication or in the preparation of the early stages, he tipped me off about Raoul and Potts, and I hadn't even mentioned them anything about it. And then digging into them, it gave me a complete new sort of palette of sort of stuff to put in the book. I sent an open letter to Beazley. Beazley is now he's the chairman of the councillors at the memorial. And I sent him, again, an open letter, because they are the only people that can change the recording of the battle history. And I concluded it by abrogating your national responsibility. You are knowingly condoning this disgraceful military deception, ensuring future generations continue to live in ignorance of a factual and proud military history. It was MacArthur's fabricated reports and all that, completely fabricated and different from reality. And there's instances everywhere that nobody at the time in the system, his battle reports were accepted verbatim and immediately put into the official military battle archives. So the whole system is locked in from there down. The other thing that happened, in 1945, the British Battles Nomenclature, the Battles Naming Committee over there to do all the battles in the Empire, because all the documentation then was now Kokoda Trail, all the media and press had to be trail, and understandably they went along with it, especially the official records from the battle. So it was that was officially called the Battle of Kokoda Trail. And 2 years later, in 1947, the Australian counterpart did the same thing. And subsequently, all the awards and that have been given out in the name of the Kokoda Trail. Never be able to unscramble the egg, I don't think. It wouldn't happen. But even 10 years ago, I was up there and I was aware of the Prime Ministers were up there, and it was to do with the Kokoda track, something about handing over some responsibility. You had Samari and I think it was Keating, were both there talking all about this Kokoda. And the transcripts revealed the whole ceremony was not trial, wasn't mentioned once. I've been in contact, with Peter Cosgrove. He's had a look and he's given me quite a good letters and that, and he says he uses track all the time. Finally, in the book, and then I come across something. It was in the archives at the memorial. Damien Parra was he kept diaries every day, was there. And I just happened to open up the volumes and volumes, and what opened up was the day, Sunday, May the 9th, and I think it was 1943, from Port Moresby. He wrote, "This war is a phony MacArthur made one. He's blown up a big balloon full of bull, and someone will prick it one day." I put my final line. Guess what? The prick has just arrived.